a trembling German shepherd puppy huddled against the cold stone of an abandoned memorial, his tiny frame no match for the dozens of crows descending around him. Their obsidian eyes fixed on his vulnerable form as their wings cast shifting shadows. Across the weathered monument, the puppy whimpered, too young to understand the danger, too weak to escape. Then something happened that defied explanation, something so extraordinary that it would change not just the puppy's fate, but the life of a man who had given up on living. Stay until the end, because this story of a forgotten veteran and an abandoned puppy will restore your faith in the power of second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Forgotten War Memorial stood on the outskirts of Riverdale. Its weathered stone bearing the names of heroes time had slowly erased. Once a place of solemn ceremonies and respectful visitation, it now sat neglected, surrounded by overgrown grass and encroaching wilderness. The American flag that once flew proudly had long since been torn away by storms, leaving only a rusted pole reaching emptily toward the sky. In the shadow of this monument to the past, a tiny German shepherd puppy shivered against the morning chill. He couldn't have been more than 4 weeks old, his ears still floppy, his paws comically oversized. For his small body, his coat, which would one day grow thick and lustrous, was now just soft puppy fuzz, inadequate protection against the October air that carried the first whispers of winter. The puppy had spent the night curled against the base of the memorial, his small body seeking warmth from the cold stone. How he had come to be there, alone and abandoned, was a mystery that would never be solved. Perhaps he had been the runt of an unwanted litter, deemed too small or weak to be worth selling. Perhaps he had been a gift that lost its appeal once the reality of puppy care became apparent. Or perhaps he had simply wandered too far from his mother and siblings, becoming lost in a world far too large for such a small creature to navigate. Whatever the circumstances, the result was the same. A vulnerable life cast aside, fighting for survival in an environment that offered little mercy to the weak or abandoned. The puppy's stomach cramped with hunger. It had been nearly a day since he'd eaten anything, and his attempts to find food had proven fruitless. He lacked the skills to hunt, the strength to travel far in search of sustenance, or the experience to identify what might be edible. His world had shrunk to this small patch of ground beside the memorial, where exhaustion had finally forced him to rest. As morning light spilled across the memorial grounds, the puppy's ears twitched at a sound above. A single crow landed on the flagpole, its black feathers gleaming in the sunlight. It tilted its head, obsidian eyes studying the small creature. Below, with an intelligence that seemed almost calculating, the bird let out a low, guttural caw that echoed across the empty grounds. Within moments, another crow appeared, then another, answering the call. They perched on the memorial, on nearby trees, on the ground itself, each arrival announced by harsh cries that seemed to communicate information the puppy couldn't understand. He instinctively pressed himself tighter against the stone, his small body trembling as he sensed the growing threat. Soon, more than 20 crows had gathered, creating a shifting circle of black feathers and sharp beaks. They hopped closer, their movements seeming almost choreographed, as if following some predetermined plan. The puppy whimpered, his tiny head swiveling as he tried to keep track of the approaching threat from all sides. One particularly large crow hopped forward, its wings slightly extended in a display that somehow commanded the attention of the others. It studied the puppy with what almost seemed like curiosity, before jabbing its beak toward the small dog's hind leg. The puppy yelped, the sound high-pitched and desperate as he scrambled to avoid the attack, only to back into another crow that pecked at his tail. Panic surged through his small body as he realized there was nowhere to run. The crows had formed a complete circle around him, cutting off any escape route. 2 miles away, in a small cabin tucked against the edge of the forest, Sergeant Marcus Reeves woke with a start, his heart hammering against his ribs. The nightmare had returned, the same one that had haunted him since his final deployment, 3 years ago. The sounds of combat still echoed in his ears as he fought to orient himself in the present. 3 years since he'd returned home. 3 years since he'd buried his teammates. 3 years of isolation and silence, broken only by the occasional visit from a VA counselor who hadn't yet given up on him, despite Marcus's best efforts to push everyone away. Marcus swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as pain shot through his left leg. The doctors had done their best, but some wounds never fully heal. The physical damage was manageable. It was the wounds no one could see that kept him trapped in this self-imposed exile. He limped to the sink and splashed cold water on his face, avoiding his reflection in the cracked mirror. He didn't need a reminder of what the war had done to him, how it had aged him far beyond his 36 years, how it had etched lines of permanent grief around his eyes, how it had left him a hollow shell of the man he'd once been. The cabin was simple, one room with basic amenities. A bed, a small kitchenette, a table with a single chair, and a bookshelf filled with military history texts he'd accumulated but rarely opened. The walls were bare save for one item, a shadow box containing his medals, including the Silver Star, awarded for the action that had cost him his team and nearly his life. Marcus had chosen this place for its isolation. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, the town 3 miles beyond that. Here, he could minimize the panic attacks triggered by crowds and unexpected noises. Here, he could drink his nightmares into submission without judgment. Here, he could slowly disappear from a world that had moved on without him. His morning routine never varied. Coffee, medication, check the perimeter of the property, bring in firewood, prepare a simple meal. The rigid structure was a poor substitute for the military discipline that had once given his life meaning, but it provided enough framework to keep him functioning at a basic level. As he stepped onto the small porch with his coffee, Marcus's attention was drawn to movement in the sky. A crow circled overhead, then another. They seemed to be gathering in the direction of the old war memorial that stood on the edge of his property. There was something unusual about their behavior. They weren't just passing through, but appeared to be congregating with purpose. Marcus had noticed the memorial when he first moved to the cabin. He'd avoided it intentionally, having no desire to be reminded of sacrifice and service. What was the point of memorializing the dead when the living were left to suffer alone? What good were stone monuments when flesh and blood veterans were forgotten? But something about the crow's behavior tugged at his attention. Their cries, carried through the clear morning air, sounding almost like signals. Marcus had learned in the military to notice patterns, to pay attention to anomalies. Something was happening at that memorial. "Not your problem," he muttered to himself, turning to go back inside. Whatever wildlife drama was unfolding, maybe the crows had cornered a mouse or found some other unfortunate creature to torment, it wasn't his concern. He had enough battles of his own without seeking out new ones. Yet as he reached for the Dr. handle, a sound carried on the breeze, high-pitched, desperate, unmistakably the cry of something young and terrified. Marcus froze, his hand suspended in midair, as the sound triggered something deep in his psyche. It was too similar to another cry he'd heard years ago, in a village that now existed only in his nightmares, the cry of innocence in danger, the cry he'd been too late to answer. Before he could rationalize his way out of involvement, Marcus found himself reaching for his walking stick and heading down the path toward the memorial, his pace quickening despite the pain in his leg. Something was pulling him forward. Call it instinct. Call it the muscle memory of a soldier responding to a threat. Call it the last remnant of the man he used to be. He didn't know what he would find at the memorial. He didn't know why he was responding to the cry of some wild animal when he'd spent years ignoring the attempts of human beings to reach him. All he knew was that for the first time in 3 years, something besides pain and regret was driving him forward, and that something was about to change his life forever. Marcus made his way toward the war memorial with increasing urgency, his military training resurfacing as he moved. Despite 3 years of neglect, his body remembered how to approach potential danger, stay low, move quietly, assess before engaging. The walking stick eased the burden on his damaged leg as he navigated the uneven terrain, his breathing measured and controlled. As he drew closer, the cacophony of crow calls intensified. Through gaps in the trees, he could see dozens of the blackbirds forming a tightening circle. At the center of their formation, almost military in its precision, was something small and vulnerable. The puppy's frightened cries grew more desperate as the largest crow made another darting attack, its sharp beak striking the tiny animal's flank. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a protective instinct he thought had died alongside his team members in that distant desert. Without conscious thought, he accelerated his approach, abandoning stealth for speed. His walking stick became a makeshift weapon as he burst into the clearing, swinging it in a wide arc that sent the nearest crows scattering in alarm. "Get away from him!" Marcus shouted, his voice hoarse from lack of use but powerful enough to momentarily stun the birds. The sudden appearance of a human, particularly one moving with such aggression, created confusion among the murder of crows. They retreated a short distance, wings flapping in protest, but did not fully disperse. Marcus positioned himself between the birds and the puppy, his stance wide and balanced despite his injury. The small German shepherd was pressed against, the base of the memorial trembling violently, a pitiful sight that triggered an unexpected surge of emotion in Marcus's chest. The puppy couldn't be more than a month old, far too young to be alone, certainly too young to defend itself against predators. The largest crow, apparently the leader of the group, launched itself forward in a bold challenge. Marcus swung his walking stick with precision, born from years of combat training, connecting firmly enough to deter without causing serious injury. The message was clear. This prey was now under protection. For a tense moment, the outcome hung in balance. The crows conferred with a series of calls, seemingly debating whether this new development warranted retreat or a coordinated attack. Marcus maintained his defensive position, his eyes scanning the formation for signs of their decision. He'd faced human enemies with less tactical coordination than these birds were displaying. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Finally, with a chorus of indignant caws, the crows began to disperse, first in pairs, then in larger groups, until only the leader remained. It fixed Marcus with what he could have sworn was an evaluating stare, before finally spreading its wings and lifting into the sky, circling once overhead before following its companions into the distance. The sudden silence felt almost oppressive after the chaotic noise. Marcus exhaled slowly, allowing the tension to drain from his muscles as he turned toward the puppy. The tiny animal remained frozen in fear, its small body still trembling uncontrollably. "Hey there, little one," Marcus said softly, lowering himself painfully to one knee. His voice, unused to gentleness after years of isolation, sounded strange to his own ears. "It's all right now. They're gone." The puppy's response was a pitiful whimper, too frightened and exhausted to move. Marcus noted with concern how prominently the puppy's ribs showed through its thin coat. Dehydrated, starving, and now traumatized by the crow attack, the animal's chances of survival without intervention were non-existent. "What am I supposed to do with you?" Marcus muttered, more to himself than to the puppy. He hadn't cared for another living thing since returning from deployment. He could barely take care of himself most days. A dependent creature was the last thing he needed in his carefully controlled isolation. Yet as the puppy finally raised its head to look at him, something in its expression, a combination of fear, hope, and desperation, struck Marcus with unexpected force. Those eyes held no judgment, no expectations, no knowledge of who Marcus had been or what he had failed to do. They simply reflected immediate need and the barest glimmer of trust that this large creature who had chased away the scary birds might represent safety. Marcus found himself reaching out slowly, allowing the puppy to sniff his fingertips. The small pink tongue that tentatively licked his hand sent an almost electric shock through his system. Physical contact, even this simple, was something he had avoided for so long that it felt alien, strangely intimate. "Guess I can't leave you out here," he finally acknowledged. "Not much of a rescue if I just walk away, is it?" With careful movements, Marcus scooped the puppy into his hand. It was small enough to fit in just one palm, a fact that reinforced its vulnerability. The tiny body trembled against his skin, but there was no struggle, as if the puppy instinctively understood that resistance would be futile, and this large being represented its only chance at survival. As Marcus stood, cradling the puppy against his chest, his eyes fell on the memorial for the first time in years. The morning light illuminated the carved names, many worn by weather and time, but still legible. Men and women who had given everything, now remembered only by eroding stone in a forgotten corner of the world. Among those names, Marcus knew, were soldiers from conflicts spanning generations: World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and more recent battles in Afghanistan and Iraq. This small community had sent its sons and daughters to fight in distant lands throughout history, many never to return except in flag-draped coffins. A wave of unexpected emotion threatened to overwhelm Marcus as he stood before the memorial. The puppy's warmth against his chest, creating a strange counterpoint to the cold stone of sacrifice. He had avoided this place, avoided all reminders of service and loss, as if ignoring them could somehow erase his own experiences. "Let's get you home, little soldier," he murmured to the puppy, turning away from the memorial with effort. The walk back to his cabin seemed longer than the journey out, his damaged leg protesting the exertion. By the time he reached his porch, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Inside the cabin, Marcus's military background asserted itself as he assessed the puppy's condition with clinical efficiency. Dehydration was the most immediate concern, followed by malnutrition and potential injuries from the crow attack. He filled a shallow bowl with water and set the puppy down beside it, watching as the small animal lapped desperately at the liquid. "Slow down," Marcus cautioned, gently pulling the bowl away after the puppy had taken enough to help, but not enough to make it sick. "Too much too fast will just make you throw it all up." Food was the next challenge. Marcus's own diet was simple and hardly suitable for a young canine. After searching through his limited supplies, he settled on a scrambled egg, cooled and broken into tiny pieces that the puppy might manage. As he prepared this makeshift meal, Marcus found himself talking to the puppy, explaining his actions, offering reassurances, even introducing himself. The sound of his own voice in the usually silent cabin was jarring but not unpleasant. The one-sided conversation felt less pathetic than his occasional attempts to talk to himself had been. "I'm Marcus," he said as he placed the plate of egg pieces on the floor. "Sergeant Marcus Reeves, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment, though that doesn't mean much now." The puppy approached the food cautiously, sniffing with interest, before devouring the offering with surprising speed. Marcus noted with approval that despite its obvious hunger, the animal showed no aggression around the food, a good sign for its temperament. "You need a name," Marcus continued, watching the puppy clean the plate with thoroughness that would have impressed his old drill sergeant. Something appropriate for a survivor. The naming of things had power. Marcus knew this from both military tradition and deeper cultural understanding. To name something was to acknowledge its existence, to establish a relationship, to accept a certain level of responsibility. For 3 years, he had avoided naming even the persistent nightmares that plagued him, as if denying them labels could diminish their reality. As the puppy finished eating and looked up at him with those trusting eyes, Marcus felt something crack in the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. This small creature needed him, completely, immediately, without complication or judgment. It offered a purpose, however simple, in a life that had become purposeless. "Phoenix," Marcus decided aloud, "because you rose from the ashes of whatever brought you to that memorial, and because everyone deserves a chance to be reborn." The irony that he was offering this philosophical optimism when he had denied himself the same opportunity wasn't lost on Marcus, but perhaps that was the point. Sometimes we can see in others what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. Phoenix, seemingly approving of his new name, took unsteady steps toward Marcus before collapsing in exhaustion against his boot. The simple trust of this gesture, the puppy's instinctive seeking of contact and warmth, stirred something that had been dormant in Marcus for too long. "Rest now," he said softly, carefully lifting the puppy and placing him on a folded towel near the wood stove. "Tomorrow, we figure out what happens next." As Phoenix immediately fell into the deep sleep of the utterly spent, Marcus found himself watching the rise and fall of the tiny chest, an odd sense of responsibility settling over him. For the first time in 3 years, he had something to think about beyond his own pain and regret. For the first time, someone depended on him to make the right decisions, and that, Marcus realized with a start, was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Marcus woke before dawn, his body still programmed to military time despite years of civilian life. For a moment, he stared at the ceiling, caught in the liminal space between sleep and wakefulness, where his mind hadn't yet remembered the weight he carried. Then, reality settled back onto his shoulders. The nightmares, the isolation, the pain that never fully subsided, but this morning something was different. A small sound drew his attention, the quiet whimpering of the puppy curled on the towel near the now cold wood stove. Phoenix was still asleep, his tiny legs twitching as he dreamed of whatever puppies dream about. Perhaps he was running through meadows he had never seen, or perhaps he was still fleeing the crows that had threatened his life. Marcus swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing at the familiar pain in his left leg. The doctors had told him it would improve with physical therapy, but he had abandoned the exercises long ago. What was the point of healing a body when the mind remained shattered? Yet as he watched Phoenix sleeping, Marcus felt a flicker of something he couldn't immediately identify. It took him a moment to recognize it as purpose, the simple, immediate need to care for this vulnerable creature. The feeling was both foreign and familiar, like a muscle memory from a life he had left behind. First things first, Marcus muttered to himself, falling into the cadence of planning that had once been second nature. Assessment, supplies, training. He moved quietly around the cabin, gathering what he would need for the day ahead. The puppy would require proper food, veterinary attention, basic supplies. Marcus made a mental inventory of what he had and what he would need to acquire. A task that would inevitably mean venturing into town, something he had avoided for weeks. The thought of facing people, of enduring their stares and questions, sent a cold spike of anxiety through his chest. In Riverdale, everyone knew who he was, the damaged veteran who had returned from war as a shadow of himself. Their pitying glances and awkward attempts at conversation were more than he could bear most days. But Phoenix needed him. That simple fact overrode Marcus's own discomfort, creating a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He would go to town because the puppy required it, not because he was ready to rejoin society. When Phoenix finally stirred, blinking sleepily at his new surroundings, Marcus was ready with a makeshift breakfast. More scrambled egg mixed with a small amount of canned tuna, the best approximation of puppy food he could manage from his limited pantry. "Good morning, recruit," Marcus said, setting the mixture down in front of the puppy. "First order of business is building your strength." Phoenix approached the food with more confidence than he had shown the previous evening, his hunger overcoming any lingering wariness. Marcus watched with satisfaction as the puppy ate, noting that despite his obvious hunger, Phoenix displayed good manners, no growling or guarding behavior, just focused consumption. "You've got decent discipline for a civilian," Marcus commented, a hint of approval in his voice. "That'll make training easier." After breakfast, Marcus faced his first major challenge of puppy care, determining Phoenix's physical condition. After his ordeal, with gentle hands that belied their strength, he examined the tiny animal, checking for injuries from the crow attack or any signs of underlying health issues. Phoenix submitted to this inspection with surprising patience, only whimpering slightly when Marcus's fingers found tender spots where the crow's beaks had made contact. None of the injuries appeared serious, small bruises and scratches rather than puncture wounds, but Marcus made mental note of each one, planning to disinfect them properly once he had supplies. "You're tougher than you look," Marcus told the puppy, who responded by licking his hand with enthusiasm. "Those birds did their best, but you held your ground." The simple act of caring for another being awakened something in Marcus that had been dormant since his return from deployment. The focused attention, the methodical assessment, the development of a care plan. These were skills he had used as a squad leader, ensuring his team members had what they needed to succeed in their missions. Skills that had once defined his identity before guilt and trauma had erased the man he used to be. After completing his assessment, Marcus faced the inevitable. He needed to go to town. He considered his options briefly, wondering if he could postpone the trip, but Phoenix's condition made that impossible. The puppy needed proper nutrition, and those small injuries, while not life-threatening, required attention to prevent infection. "Looks like we're both leaving the wire today," Marcus said, his voice strained, despite his attempt at casual military humor. "Mission objective, puppy supplies, and veterinary reconnaissance." The preparation for town felt oddly like gearing up for a patrol. Marcus showered and shaved, basic grooming he often neglected when not expecting contact with others. He chose clothes that would attract minimal attention, though in a town as small as Riverdale, his mere presence would be noteworthy regardless of what he wore. The question of what to do with Phoenix during his absence resolved itself when the puppy followed Marcus's movements with such obvious anxiety that leaving him alone seemed cruel. "Separation anxiety," Marcus diagnosed, recognizing the signs from his own experience with combat stress. "Understandable after what you've been through." With careful consideration, Marcus created a makeshift carrier from a small cardboard box lined with the towel Phoenix had slept on, familiar with the puppy's scent. Large enough for comfort but small enough for security, it would allow him to transport Phoenix without exposing him to additional stress. Before departing, Marcus faced one final challenge. His truck hadn't been started in over 3 weeks. The old Ford Ranger had been reliable during his military service, following him from base to base until his final discharge. Now it sat rarely used, a relic of a life where movement and purpose had been constants. To Marcus's relief, the engine turned over after a few attempts, rumbling to life with a sound that triggered a cascade of memories. Road trips with fellow rangers, supply runs on foreign bases, the simple freedom of the open road before war, had narrowed his world to the confined space of his cabin. First victory of the day, he told Phoenix, who was now situated in his box on the passenger seat, secured with the seatbelt. Always acknowledge progress, no matter how small. Drive to Riverdale took less than 15 minutes, but for Marcus, it might as well have been a journey to another country. The familiar anxiety tightened his chest as buildings appeared on the horizon. The small community center, the grocery store, the single-pump gas station that doubled as the local gathering spot. Marcus parked in front of the veterinary clinic, which also served as the town's pet supply store, a common arrangement in communities too small to support separate businesses. He took several deep breaths, using the calming techniques his VA counselor had taught him, but which he rarely employed. "Stay focused on the mission," he reminded himself, glancing at Phoenix, who watched him with complete trust. "This isn't about you, it's about him." With that thought anchoring him, Marcus gathered the puppy carrier and stepped out of the truck. Each step toward the clinic door required conscious effort, not just because of his physical injury, but because of the psychological barriers he had constructed between himself and the world. The bell above the door announced his entrance with cheerful innocence, immediately drawing the attention of the woman behind the counter. Dr. Sarah Chen looked up from her computer, her expression shifting from professional greeting to surprise as she recognized the town's most reclusive resident. "Sergeant Reeves," she said, using his military title with the automatic respect characteristic of small-town America. "This is, unexpected." Marcus steeled himself against the urge to retreat. "I need assistance," he said, his voice rougher than intended. He placed the carrier on the counter and opened it to reveal Phoenix. "Found him yesterday. He was being attacked by crows at the war memorial." Dr. Chen's focus immediately shifted to the puppy, her professional training overriding any curiosity about Marcus's rare appearance in town. "Poor little guy," she said, gently lifting Phoenix from the box. "He's severely underweight and dehydrated." The examination that followed was thorough and efficient. Dr. Chen checked Phoenix's temperature, listened to his heart and lungs, examined his eyes, ears and teeth, and carefully inspected each of the small injuries from the crow attack. Throughout the process, she maintained a running commentary that was as much for Marcus's benefit as it was professional observation. "He's about 4 weeks old, which is very young to be separated from his mother," she explained, measuring Phoenix's weight on a small scale. "Normally, they stay with their mother until at least 8 weeks. He's underweight, but not critically so. The dehydration is more concerning, but you did the right thing giving him water in small amounts." Marcus absorbed this information with the same intensity he had once applied to mission briefings. "What does he need? Food? Medicine? I don't have any supplies." Dr. Chen's expression softened at the evident concern in his voice. "He needs special puppy formula until he's a bit older and stronger. The regular food can wait a week or 2. I'll give you medication for the cuts to prevent infection, but they're superficial. Mostly, he needs consistent care and monitoring." She hesitated, then added carefully, "Mr. Reeves, raising a puppy this young requires significant commitment. They need feeding every few hours, constant supervision, socialization. It's almost like caring for an infant. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility?" The question hung in the air between them, its implications extending far beyond puppy care. Was he, Marcus Reeves, isolated, traumatized, barely functioning some days, capable of providing the consistent care this vulnerable creature needed? Was he stable enough, present enough, whole enough. 3 years ago, Marcus had been responsible for the lives of his squad members, making split-second decisions in combat situations that determined whether they returned home. Now the prospect of caring for one small puppy seemed simultaneously simpler and more daunting. The puppy wouldn't die from a wrong tactical decision, but he could suffer from neglect, born of Marcus's own damaged psyche. Marcus looked at Phoenix, who was watching him from the examination table with that same expression of complete trust he had shown since being rescued. In the puppy's eyes, Marcus wasn't a broken soldier or a recluse. He was simply the human who had saved him, who had provided food and safety when all seemed lost. "I found him," Marcus said finally, his voice firm with a conviction that surprised even himself. "That makes him my responsibility. I'll do whatever it takes." Dr. Chen studied him for a moment, then nodded with professional acceptance. "Then let's get you equipped for success. I'll put together everything you'll need for the first week, and we'll schedule a follow-up appointment to check his progress." As she gathered supplies, special formula, a proper feeding bottle, medications, puppy pads, a small collar, and a soft blanket, Marcus felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in 3 years, someone had given him a mission that mattered, even if that someone was himself. Phoenix wasn't a replacement for what he had lost. The puppy couldn't erase the memories or heal the wounds that had driven Marcus into isolation, but he represented something Marcus had forgotten existed, the possibility of moving forward one small step at a time. The first night with Phoenix established a pattern that would define Marcus's life in the coming weeks. Every 2 hours, his watch alarm would vibrate, pulling him from fitful sleep into immediate alertness, a remnant of combat deployments where deep sleep could be fatal. Each time, he would prepare a small amount of the puppy formula, warming it to body temperature with the precision of someone who understood that details matter when lives depend on them. Phoenix soon learned to anticipate these nighttime feedings, whimpering softly from his makeshift bed, now a proper puppy cushion purchased from Dr. Chen, whenever Marcus stirred. The tiny shepherd would drink eagerly, his strength visibly increasing with each passing day as proper nutrition began to counteract the effects of his earlier abandonment. "You're putting on weight, soldier," Marcus observed on the 4th night, noting how the puppy's ribs were less prominent under his soft fur. "Good progress." These nocturnal routines created an unexpected benefit for Marcus himself. The predictable interruptions prevented him from falling into the deeper phases of sleep where nightmares lurked. Instead of waking in cold sweat, heart pounding from relived trauma, he woke with purpose. A living creature needed him. The responsibility anchored him to the present in ways that years of therapy had failed to achieve. During daylight hours, Marcus established training protocols adapted from his military experience but softened for his young charge. He wasn't raising a military working dog, but the structure of regular feeding, consistent commands, and clear boundaries provided security for both Phoenix and himself. "Clear communication prevents casualties," Marcus explained to the puppy as he introduced basic commands. "You need to understand what I'm asking, and I need to understand what you're telling me." Phoenix proved to be an intelligent and eager student, his eyes tracking Marcus's every movement with an intensity that reminded the veteran of new recruits desperate to impress their sergeant. The puppy's determination, despite his small size and young age, sparked something like respect in Marcus, a recognition of shared resilience. On the 7th day, during their morning routine, Marcus noticed Phoenix struggling to stand, his hind legs wobbling before collapsing under him. The puppy whimpered, trying again with the same result. Alarm shot through Marcus's system, his pulse accelerating as he recognized a potentially serious development. "What's happening, buddy?" he asked, kneeling to examine the puppy. Phoenix's eyes were clear, his nose wet and cool as it should be, but his hindquarters seemed unresponsive to his efforts to stand. When Marcus gently palpated the area, the puppy yelped in pain. Fear clutched at Marcus's throat, a feeling he had suppressed during combat, but which now surged unchecked. In just 1 week, this small creature had become vitally important to him. The prospect of losing Phoenix triggered the same protective instinct that had once driven him to risk everything for his squad members, the drive to Dr. Chen's clinic was a blur of anxiety and self-recrimination. Had he missed something, fed Phoenix incorrectly, failed to notice earlier symptoms? The spiraling thoughts were familiar, the same pattern that had followed the ambush that claimed his team. Had he made the wrong call, missed intelligence, led them into danger through his own failure? Dr. Chen took one look at Marcus's face when he burst through the clinic door and immediately cleared her schedule. "Bring him back," she directed, leading them to an examination room without the usual preliminaries. The examination was thorough, though Phoenix's cries when Dr. Chen manipulated his hind legs nearly broke Marcus's composure. He stood rigid, fists clenched, forcing himself to remain calm, though every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to protect. "I believe it's spinal inflammation," Dr. Chen finally announced, "possibly from trauma during the crow attack, or from falling or being dropped before you found him. The symptoms can appear days or even weeks after the initial injury. Will he recover?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Dr. Chen's expression was compassionately honest. "It depends. With proper medication, restricted movement and physical therapy, he has a good chance. But I need to be clear. There's no guarantee he'll regain full mobility. He might always have weakness in his hind legs." The words hit Marcus with physical force, a permanent disability, limitation, adaptation required. The parallels to his own condition were too obvious to ignore, and for a moment the walls of the examination room seemed to close in around him. "What does he need?" Marcus asked, cutting through his own emotional response to focus on immediate action. It was the same technique he had used after being wounded. Compartmentalize, prioritize, execute. Dr. Chen outlined a treatment plan that included anti-inflammatory medications, strict rest, and eventually gentle exercises to rebuild strength. "The next 3 weeks are critical," she explained. "He'll need constant monitoring and care." Marcus absorbed the instructions with military focus, asking clarifying questions and taking mental notes. This was a mission with clear parameters and objectives, exactly the kind of challenge his training had prepared him to meet. "One more thing," Dr. Chen added, as they prepared to leave. "He'll need help with everything, eating, drinking, eliminating waste. He'll be completely dependent on you. If that's too much—" "It's not," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm with resolve. "He's my responsibility. I won't abandon him." The return to the cabin marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. Marcus converted his small, living space into a rehabilitation center, creating a confined, padded area where Phoenix could rest without attempting to move. He set up a schedule on his military watch, with alarms for medication, feeding, and the gentle massage Dr. Chen had demonstrated to improve circulation. Through that first day and night, Marcus maintained vigilance with the same intensity he had once reserved for combat operations. He measured Phoenix's water intake, monitored his temperature for signs of infection, and carefully recorded each small development in a journal that began to fill with detailed observations. The routine was exhausting, but purposeful. When Phoenix whimpered from discomfort or frustration at his immobility, Marcus found himself sharing stories from his own recovery, speaking aloud for the first time about the months of rehabilitation he had endured after his injury. "The hardest part isn't the pain," he told Phoenix during one late-night medication session. "It's accepting that your body won't respond the way it used to. that you have to find new ways to accomplish what once came naturally. As he spoke, Marcus realized he was articulating thoughts he had never shared with therapists or doctors, insights about disability and adaptation that he had internalized but never expressed. Phoenix watched him with those attentive eyes, offering the perfect audience, present, non-judgmental, unable to offer platitudes or unwanted advice. On the third night of their new routine, Marcus found himself reaching for the bottle of whiskey he kept for the worst evenings when sleep was impossible without chemical assistance. His hand hovered over the bottle as exhaustion and anxiety competed for dominance. A drink would dull the edges, make the night more manageable. A soft whine from Phoenix's bed caught his attention. The puppy was awake, watching him with that peculiar intensity that seemed to see beyond Marcus's carefully constructed barriers. "You're right," Marcus said, withdrawing his hand from the bottle. "Can't be at my best for you if I'm dulling my senses." The decision wasn't dramatic or permanent, no promises of sobriety or recovery, just a simple choice to remain present and alert because someone needed him to be. Yet in that small moment of choosing responsibility over escape, Marcus felt a shift in his relationship with his own damaged psyche. By the end of the first week of Phoenix's treatment, both patient and caregiver had settled into their new reality. The puppy remained largely immobile, but showed improving spirits, responding eagerly to Marcus's voice and accepting the limitations of his condition with a resilience that seemed almost unnatural in one so young. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself more engaged with the present than he had been in years. The demands of Phoenix's care left little time for dwelling on the past or dreading the future. Each day presented immediate challenges that required his full attention, challenges he could meet with the skills and discipline that had once defined his identity. On the morning marking 10 days of treatment, Marcus woke to an unexpected sound, a scratching, scraping noise coming from Phoenix's bed. He rose quickly, concerned that the puppy might be in distress or pain. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. Phoenix was attempting to stand, his front legs steady while his hind legs trembled with effort. The determination in the small animal's posture was unmistakable, a refusal to remain immobile, despite the obvious difficulty. "Easy there, warrior," Marcus said softly, kneeling beside the bed. "Don't push too hard too fast." Phoenix looked up at him, and Marcus would have sworn he saw frustration in those expressive eyes, the same impatience he had felt during his own recovery when progress seemed insufferably slow. The recognition of that shared experience created a moment of profound connection between man and dog. "I know," Marcus acknowledged, gently supporting Phoenix's hindquarters while allowing him to bear weight on his front legs. "Being limited feels like a betrayal when you remember what you used to be capable of." Together, they worked through a modified version of the exercises Dr. Chen had prescribed, with Marcus providing just enough support to prevent strain while allowing Phoenix to rebuild strength through controlled movement. Throughout the session, Marcus found himself offering the same kind of quiet encouragement that had helped him through his darkest moments of physical therapy. "Small victories," he reminded Phoenix, as the puppy managed to maintain his standing position for a full minute before needing to rest. "Every day, a little stronger than the day before. That's how we rebuild." As he helped Phoenix settle back into a comfortable position after their first impromptu therapy session, Marcus realized that his leg was aching from kneeling on the hard cabin floor. He had been so focused on the puppy's needs that he had ignored his own discomfort, something that hadn't happened since before his injury. The realization brought with it an uncomfortable question. If he could push through pain to help Phoenix recover, why had he abandoned his own rehabilitation? Why had he accepted limitation as final rather than fighting to regain what was possible? These questions followed Marcus through the day, creating a restlessness he hadn't felt in years. That evening, as Phoenix slept after his medication, Marcus found himself doing something he had avoided since returning home. He opened the box containing his physical therapy exercises, prescribed but long ignored. The laminated sheets looked pristine, untouched by use. Marcus spread them on the floor, studying the illustrations of stretches and strengthening movements designed to improve mobility in his damaged leg. Dr. Patel, his physical therapist at the VA, had assured him that consistent effort would yield significant improvement, but Marcus had been too lost in psychological pain to commit to the physical work of recovery. "Time to lead by example," he told Phoenix's sleeping form. "Can't expect you to fight if I've surrendered." The exercises were painful, his muscles protesting years of neglect. Marcus breathed through the discomfort, applying the same mental discipline he was encouraging in Phoenix. By the time he finished the basic routine, sweat dampened his shirt, and his leg throbbed. But beneath the pain was something unexpected, a sense of accomplishment that had been absent from his life for too long. As Marcus prepared for sleep that night, he found himself setting a new alarm on his watch, not for Phoenix's care, but for his own morning exercise routine. It was a small commitment, insignificant against the backdrop of all he had lost. Yet, it represented something profound, a choice to move forward rather than remain static, to rebuild rather than merely exist. "One day at a time, Phoenix," Marcus murmured, as he checked on the sleeping puppy one last time. "For both of us." 3 weeks into Phoenix's recovery marked a turning point for both dog and owner. The shepherd puppy, no longer quite so tiny, had begun to move with increasing confidence despite the lingering weakness in his hind legs. Each day brought noticeable improvement. First standing unassisted, then tentative steps, now short periods of cautious exploration around the cabin's main room. Marcus tracked these developments in his journal with meticulous detail, recording not just physical progress, but behavioral changes as well. The puppy, who had once been too weak to protest, was now developing a distinct personality. Curious, determined, and surprisingly gentle for a breed known for its protective instincts. "You've got heart, Phoenix," Marcus observed, as he watched the puppy navigate the small obstacle course he had created from cushions and low boxes. Most would have given up by now. The physical therapy sessions had become the centerpiece of their daily routine, with both patient and caretaker pushing their respective limits. Marcus had graduated from basic stretches to more demanding exercises, following the long-neglected rehabilitation program with the same discipline he applied to Phoenix's care. The parallel recoveries created a rhythm to their days that Marcus found unexpectedly comforting. For the first time since his return from deployment, he experienced the satisfaction of measurable progress, not just in Phoenix, but in himself as well. The constant pain in his leg hadn't disappeared, but it had diminished to a manageable ache rather than the debilitating agony that had once defined his existence. On this particular morning, Marcus sat on the cabin's small porch, drinking coffee, while Phoenix explored the fenced area he had constructed for supervised outdoor time. The puppy moved with careful deliberation, testing each step before committing his weight, compensating for his weaker hind legs with a slightly modified gait that nonetheless allowed for effective movement. "Good form," Marcus called encouragingly. "Adapt and overcome." The phrase, a mantra from his military days, no longer felt like hollow words. He had witnessed Phoenix embodying that principle daily, finding new ways to accomplish what his injury had made difficult. The puppy never seemed frustrated by his limitations, only determined to work within them to achieve his goals. It was a lesson Marcus was slowly relearning himself. His own exercises had progressed to include short walks, first around the cabin, then down the path toward the memorial and back. Each day he pushed a little further, marking his progress not in distance alone, but in reduced recovery time and increased stamina. Marcus was preparing for their afternoon therapy session when the unfamiliar sound of tires on gravel cut through the cabin's usual silence. Visitors were rare enough to trigger immediate alertness, a conditioning from both military service and years of self-imposed isolation. Phoenix, sensing the change in Marcus's posture, moved closer to his leg, instinctively protective despite his small size. Through the window, Marcus spotted a blue sedan he didn't recognize pulling up beside his truck. The car was government issue, not military or law enforcement, but the kind driven by social workers and VA personnel. His body tensed involuntarily, adrenaline spiking at this unexpected intrusion into his carefully controlled environment. A woman emerged from the vehicle, mid-30s, dressed in casual but professional attire, carrying a leather messenger bag rather than a standard briefcase. Something about her confident posture and alert awareness of her surroundings suggested military background, though she didn't move with the rigidity of active duty personnel. Marcus considered not answering her knock, retreating into the familiar security of avoidance. But Phoenix, contrary to this instinct, moved toward the door with curious interest, his tail wagging tentatively, a social response Marcus hadn't observed in him before. "Traitor," Marcus muttered to the puppy, but the accusation held no heat. With resigned determination, he opened the door before the woman could knock. Her momentary surprise suggested she hadn't expected such prompt response, or perhaps any response at all. She recovered quickly, offering a smile that seemed genuine rather than professional. "Sergeant Reeves, I'm Captain Elena Ramirez, Veterans Outreach Coordinator for the Regional VA office." She extended her hand with the directness of someone accustomed to command. "Dr. Chen mentioned you might benefit from a visit." Marcus hesitated before accepting the handshake, his mind processing several things simultaneously. Captain Army, not VA bureaucrat. Veterans Outreach, not clinical services or benefits administration. And most significantly, Dr. Chen had discussed him with this woman, suggesting some form of intervention. "I don't recall requesting outreach services," he said, his tone carefully neutral despite the internal spike of defensiveness. Captain Ramirez nodded, acknowledging the implicit boundary. "You didn't. But when a decorated ranger rescues a puppy and commits to rehabilitation that most experienced dog owners would find daunting, it catches attention." Her eyes moved to Phoenix, who was studying her with open curiosity, especially when that same ranger has declined all VA services for the past 18 months. The statement wasn't accusatory but matter-of-fact, delivered with the straightforwardness of one soldier to another. Marcus appreciated the absence of psychological jargon or patronizing concern, even as he maintained his guard against this unexpected intrusion. "Phoenix needed help," he said simply. "I provided it." "May I come in?" Ramirez asked, apparently unfazed by his terseness. "I've brought some resources that might interest you, and it looks like it might rain soon." She glanced at the darkening sky, practical concerns overriding social niceties. Marcus weighed his options, instinct warring with courtesy. Phoenix made the decision for him by approaching Ramirez with friendly interest, his tail wagging with increasing confidence. The puppy, who had shown wariness with Dr. Chen, now displayed immediate acceptance of this stranger, a judgment Marcus found himself reluctantly trusting. "Briefly," he conceded, stepping back to allow her entry. Captain Ramirez moved into the cabin with respectful awareness, not examining her surroundings with the clinical assessment he had come to expect from VA personnel, but simply acknowledging the space as his territory. She waited for his gesture toward a chair before sitting, placing her messenger bag beside her but making no move to open it immediately. Good-looking dog, she commented, watching as Phoenix settled himself near Marcus's feet. German Shepherd. Yes, Marcus confirmed. Found him being attacked by crows at the War Memorial about a month ago. So Dr. Chen mentioned. She also said he suffered spinal trauma that affected his mobility. Ramirez's eyes noted the obstacle. Course and therapy equipment with professional assessment. Looks like you've set up comprehensive rehabilitation. Marcus nodded, unwilling to elaborate but acknowledging the accuracy of her observation. The conversation lapsed into silence, not the uncomfortable void civilians tend to fill with nervous chatter, but the patient quiet of those accustomed to waiting in challenging circumstances. Finally, Ramirez spoke again. I didn't come here to evaluate you, Sergeant, or to push services you haven't requested. I'm here because of a new program we're developing that seems particularly relevant to your situation. She reached into her messenger bag and withdrew a folder, placing it on the small table between them. We're establishing a service dog training program specifically for combat-wounded veterans. The dogs are rescued from shelters or difficult circumstances, rehabilitated if necessary, and then trained by veterans who can benefit from both the process and the eventual partnership. Marcus made no move toward the folder, but his attention sharpened, and Dr. Chen suggested I needed a service dog. Ramirez smiled slightly. Actually, she suggested we needed you, as a trainer, not a recipient. The statement was unexpected, enough to break through Marcus's careful neutrality. Me? I have no qualifications in dog training. Don't you? Ramirez gestured toward Phoenix, who had positioned himself to maintain line of sight with both humans. You've rehabilitated a severely injured puppy to the point where he's mobile and thriving. You've established training protocols, adapted from military principles, but individualized for his specific needs. You've demonstrated patience, consistency, and the ability to recognize small improvements that others might miss. She leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. Those are exactly the qualities we need in our trainers. Technical dog training skills can be taught. The insight that comes from personal experience with injury and recovery can't be. Marcus felt a complex surge of emotions at her words. Surprise at the recognition of skills he hadn't consciously acknowledged. Wariness of being drawn into institutional involvement, and beneath these, a flicker of something that might have been interest. I'm not interested in returning to any form of service, he said, the statement automatic after years of declining various reintegration opportunities. Aren't you? Ramirez's question was gentle but direct. She nodded toward Phoenix. What would you call what you've been doing for him these past weeks? The question struck with unexpected force, challenging the narrative Marcus had constructed around his isolation. He had framed his care for Phoenix as a private responsibility, separate from the concept of service that had once defined his identity. Yet the parallels were undeniable. The discipline, the commitment to something beyond himself, the willingness to endure discomfort to achieve necessary goals. That's different, he insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Is it? Ramirez didn't press further, allowing the question to hang in the air between them. After a moment, she continued, The program is in its early stages. We need veterans who understand both the challenges of recovery and the unique bond that develops through that process. Your participation could be as limited or extensive as you're comfortable with. Consulting initially, perhaps eventually working directly with the dogs and their potential handlers. She stood, respecting the brevity she had promised. I'll leave the information for you to review. There's no pressure or timeline for decision. My contact details are in the folder if you have questions. As she moved toward the door, she paused, looking down at Phoenix, who had followed her movement with interest. He's going to be an exceptional dog, she observed. the ones who overcome early trauma often develop extraordinary capacity for connection. They recognize pain in others because they've experienced it themselves. The words carried implications beyond the puppy, though Ramirez was tactful enough not to make the comparison explicit, with a final nod that communicated professional respect rather than pity. She departed, leaving Marcus standing in the cabin that suddenly felt different, as if her presence had somehow altered its dimensions or changed its relationship to the wider world. Phoenix moved to the window, watching Ramirez's car disappear down the gravel drive before turning back to Marcus with an expression that seemed almost questioning. The folder on the table represented a choice Marcus had assumed he would never face again, the possibility of reconnection, of purpose beyond private existence. For the remainder of that day, Marcus continued their established routine: medications, therapy exercises, meals, short walks, while the folder remained untouched on the table. Yet its presence hovered at the edge of his awareness, challenging the boundaries he had established between himself and potential engagement with the world. That evening, after Phoenix had settled into sleep, Marcus finally approached the folder. His hand hesitated above it, the simple act of reaching out representing a decision more significant than mere curiosity. To open it was to acknowledge the possibility, however remote, of a different future than the one he had resigned himself to living. The first page contained a program overview, objectives, structure, preliminary outcomes from similar initiatives in other regions, clinical language that neither inspired nor deterred. But as Marcus continued reading, he found case studies of other veterans who had participated in dog training programs, their backgrounds, challenges, and the transformative experiences many reported. One paragraph in particular caught his attention. Veterans report that the process of guiding a dog through rehabilitation and training creates a unique form of reciprocal healing. In teaching skills of adaptation and confidence to their canine partners, many find themselves rediscovering these qualities in themselves. Marcus glanced at Phoenix, sleeping peacefully in his bed, the evidence of their shared journey visible in the puppy's improving strength and growing confidence. Had there been reciprocity in that process? Had Marcus benefited from Phoenix's recovery as much as Phoenix had benefited from his care? The question followed him into uneasy sleep, where for the first time in years his dreams contained not just echoes of past trauma, but glimpses of possible futures, uncertain and challenging, yet somehow less confined than the existence he had accepted as inevitable. 2 months after rescuing Phoenix, Marcus faced a decision he'd been postponing. The folder from Captain Ramirez had migrated from the table to his desk, its contents now dog-eared from multiple readings. The service dog training program was scheduled to begin preliminary assessments in 3 weeks, and the deadline for indicating interest was approaching. Marcus sat on the porch steps, watching Phoenix navigate the expanded exercise area with growing confidence. The puppy's gait still showed evidence of his injury, a slight hitch in his stride when tired, occasional weakness in his right hind leg. But the transformation from the trembling, helpless creature Marcus had rescued was remarkable by any standard. 6-minute circuit today, Marcus noted aloud, checking the stopwatch function on his watch. Personal best. Phoenix responded to the approval in his voice with visible pride, tail raised as he completed the final obstacle and trotted toward Marcus with the special bouncing gait he had developed to compensate for his lingering weakness. The adaptation was so effective that someone unfamiliar with his history might not immediately notice his disability. Dr. Chen had been impressed during their most recent checkup, declaring Phoenix's recovery exceptional, given the severity of the initial trauma. She had diplomatically avoided attributing this success to Marcus's intensive rehabilitation efforts, but her meaning had been clear in the way she reviewed his detailed treatment logs with professional respect. "You've given him every possible advantage," she had commented. "Many animals with similar injuries never regain this level of function, even with professional rehabilitation." The acknowledgement had left Marcus with complicated feelings: pride in Phoenix's progress, satisfaction in seeing his efforts yield results, but also an uncomfortable awareness of the contrast between his commitment to the puppy's recovery and his abandonment of his own. This disparity had become increasingly difficult to ignore as his informal parallel rehabilitation continued. The exercises he had initially undertaken merely to set an example for Phoenix had evolved into a consistent program that was producing undeniable results. His damaged leg, while still far from normal, had regained significant strength and flexibility. The chronic pain had diminished from constant presence to occasional reminder. Most significantly, Marcus had begun extending their walks beyond the confines of his property. What began as therapeutic necessity had gradually transformed into genuine exploration, first to the memorial where he had found Phoenix, then to the surrounding woods, and most recently to the edges of town itself. These excursions remained carefully planned to minimize unexpected encounters, but the mere fact that Marcus was willingly venturing beyond his self-imposed boundaries represented a shift he could neither deny nor fully explain. Something had changed in the foundations of his isolated existence, creating hairline fractures in walls he had believed impenetrable. Phoenix completed a victory lap around the yard before returning to collapse dramatically at Marcus's feet, pantomiming exhaustion with the theatrical flair of a puppy who had discovered the connection between expressive behavior and human attention. Marcus smiled despite himself, recognizing the manipulation but appreciating the intelligence behind it. "Good work deserves proper recognition," he acknowledged, reaching down to scratch behind the shepherd's ears. "Mission accomplished for today." The military terminology had become their shared language, a framework that provided structure while allowing for the developing emotional bond that Marcus had initially resisted. He had begun using it almost unconsciously in those first critical days of Phoenix's treatment, falling back on the communication patterns that felt most natural to him. Surprisingly, the puppy had seemed to respond to the clear, consistent commands and the measured praise that followed successful execution. Dr. Chen had noticed this dynamic during their visits, commenting that German shepherds often thrived with training approaches that emphasized purpose and accomplishment. "They're working dogs by nature," she had explained. "They need to feel useful, to have challenges to overcome. It's not just about physical exercise. They need mental stimulation and a sense of contributing to something larger than themselves." The parallel to human psychology, particularly that of soldiers struggling with civilian transition, had been too obvious to require explicit mention. Marcus had recognized his own experience in her description, the sense of disorientation and purposelessness that had characterized his return to civilian life. Now, watching Phoenix rest after their training session, Marcus confronted the question that had been forming in his mind since Captain Ramirez's visit. Was he doing enough? Not just for Phoenix, whose needs were being met with increasing effectiveness, but for himself, for the potential he still possessed despite his injuries, both physical and psychological. The service dog program represented a specific opportunity, but the question extended beyond that particular option. Was the isolated existence he had created for himself post-deployment truly the best use of his remaining capabilities? Or was it merely the easiest path, the one that required the least confrontation with painful realities and uncertain futures? These questions had no simple answers, but their persistent presence signaled a significant change from the emotional flatness that had characterized the years before Phoenix. Even asking such questions represented movement from the fixed certainty of permanent isolation toward something more dynamic, more open to possibility. As Marcus pondered these thoughts, Phoenix suddenly lifted his head, ears alert to a sound Marcus hadn't yet registered. Seconds later, the distinctive rumble of a vehicle approaching on the gravel drive reached his ears, different from Dr. Chen's compact car or Captain Ramirez's government sedan. This was something larger, heavier. A black pickup truck appeared. Around the bend, weathered but well-maintained, with Veterans of Foreign Wars plates and a faded 10th Mountain Division sticker on the rear window. Marcus didn't recognize the vehicle, but the military identification created immediate context. Another veteran, someone who spoke the same language of service and sacrifice. The truck stopped at a respectful distance, and the driver remained, seated for a moment, displaying the situational awareness characteristic of those trained to assess before engaging. This consideration for Marcus's space and potential triggers identified the visitor as clearly as any uniform could have. When the door finally opened, a man in his early 60s emerged, tall and lean, with the straight posture military service ingrains beyond retirement. His hair was silver grey, cut in a style that suggested continued adherence to standards no longer required but deeply ingrained. He approached slowly, hands visible, eyes taking in details without appearing to stare. "Sergeant Reeves," he called, from a distance that respected personal boundaries while ensuring he could be heard clearly. "Frank Calloway, VFW Post 3891. Got a minute to talk?" Marcus had deliberately avoided contact with veterans organizations since his return, declining invitations and ignoring outreach attempts with the same determined isolation he had applied to all social connections. Yet something about this man's direct approach and the absence of forced enthusiasm gave him pause. Phoenix, surprisingly, showed none of the caution he typically displayed with strangers. Instead, he moved to stand beside Marcus, alert but not alarmed, his tail maintaining a neutral position as he assessed the newcomer. "What about?" Marcus responded, neither inviting approach nor rejecting it outright. Calloway gestured toward Phoenix. "Heard about your rescue from Dr. Chen's assistant. Her son's in my Vietnam Veterans Support Group." He shrugged slightly, acknowledging the small-town information network that Marcus had forgotten existed after years of isolation. "Thought you might want to know about our K9 Veterans Day event next month. Small ceremony honoring service dogs, past and present." The connection wasn't what Marcus had expected. Not a recruitment attempt for the VFW, or an invitation to standard veterans functions, but something specific to his current circumstances with Phoenix. The thoughtfulness of this approach suggested genuine consideration rather than generic outreach. "Phoenix isn't a service dog," Marcus clarified, though he found himself moving down the porch steps rather than maintaining his distant position. "He's a rescue with some special needs." Calloway nodded, unsurprised by this correction. "So I heard. But the event honors all dogs who've served veterans, officially or otherwise. Some of the most important service happens without certification or formal training." His eyes, sharp despite his age, noted Marcus's physical stance with professional assessment. "Looks like he's been good medicine." The observation was delivered without the emotional overlay Marcus had come to expect from civilians discussing veterans' issues. No forced gratitude for his service, no uncomfortable pity for his evident injuries, just straightforward recognition of a beneficial partnership. "He's made progress," Marcus acknowledged, matching Calloway's tone with similar understatement. Phoenix, apparently deciding the newcomer had been adequately evaluated, approached Calloway with cautious interest. The older veteran waited for Marcus's slight nod before extending his hand for the puppy to investigate, demonstrating both respect for Marcus's authority and understanding of proper protocol with a dog still in training. "Good structure," Calloway commented as Phoenix completed his inspection and allowed a brief pat on his shoulder. "German Shepherds were the first official military working dogs, you know. World War I. They've been serving alongside us ever since." The historical context wasn't new information to Marcus, but Calloway's presentation reflected genuine appreciation rather than an attempt to impress. This authenticity, combined with the older veteran's respectful approach to both dog and owner, created an unexpected sense of connection, the recognition of shared values across different eras of service. "When is the event?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with the question that implied potential interest rather than automatic refusal. 3 weeks from Saturday," Calloway replied, careful not to overreact to this opening. "Small gathering at the memorial where you found him. Seemed fitting." He reached into his pocket and extracted a simple business card with the VFW information and his personal number handwritten on the back. "No pressure either way. Just thought you should know the option exists." As Calloway turned to leave, Phoenix made a soft sound, not quite a whine, but clearly communicating some form of resistance to the visitor's departure. The puppy glanced at Marcus, then back at Calloway, his expressive eyes conveying what seemed remarkably like a request for continued interaction. The moment created a crossroads, an opportunity to either maintain established boundaries or take a small step toward expanded connection. Marcus found himself at this junction without the automatic rejection that had characterized similar moments in the past, genuinely weighing options rather than reflexively choosing isolation. "Would you like to see his training setup?" Marcus heard himself ask, the invitation emerging from some part of himself he barely recognized, a part that remembered the value of shared experience and specialized knowledge. Calloway's expression remained neutral, though his eyes reflected, understanding of what the invitation represented. "If you're offering, I'd appreciate that. Working with my own rescue lab after I got back from Desert Storm. Different issues, but similar challenges." As Marcus led the way toward Phoenix's exercise area, he experienced a strange sense of déjà vu, not to his combat deployments or subsequent isolation, but to earlier training experiences where knowledge was freely exchanged between those who understood its value. The feeling wasn't entirely comfortable, carrying echoes of connections he had deliberately severed, yet it wasn't as threatening as he had expected. This small step, allowing another veteran into his space, sharing something of value he had created, represented a milestone as significant as any in Phoenix's physical recovery. It marked movement from absolute isolation toward selective connection, from rigid boundaries toward thoughtful discernment. As Calloway examined the rehabilitation equipment with genuine interest, offering occasional observations from his own experience without attempting to override Marcus's approach, Phoenix moved between them with growing animation, as if recognizing the importance of this interaction, not just for himself, but for the human he had come to trust. The visit lasted less than an hour, respectful of Marcus's limits while establishing potential for future contact. When Calloway departed, leaving the K9 Veterans Day information and his personal number, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed somehow altered, the space between absolute isolation and full reintegration now containing an intermediate possibility that hadn't existed before. That evening, as Marcus reviewed Phoenix's progress in his journal, he found himself adding a new entry in a section he had previously left blank. Personal objectives. The items he listed were modest: attend the K9 event if Phoenix's progress continued, consider Calloway's invitation to meet his lab, review the service dog program materials with specific questions in mind. Small steps, each carrying significant Wait for a man who had believed himself permanently withdrawn from meaningful participation in the world beyond his cabin. Yet as he watched Phoenix sleeping peacefully after his most successful day of training yet, Marcus recognized that progress often begins not with dramatic transformations, but with incremental shifts in what seems possible. The puppy who had faced death at the memorial had not healed all at once, but through daily effort and consistent care. Perhaps the same approach might serve for other types of recovery as well. The day of the K9 veteran ceremony arrived with perfect autumn weather, clear skies, mild temperatures, and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Marcus stood at his cabin window, dressed in clothing he had selected with uncharacteristic deliberation. Dark jeans without fraying, a pressed button-down shirt, and his leather jacket that had remained unworn in his closet since his return to civilian life. Phoenix sensed the significance of their preparation, remaining unusually still as Marcus attached the new collar purchased specifically for this occasion, a simple military-style design in olive drab with the puppy's name embroidered alongside. A small American flag. Not quite 4 months old, Phoenix had grown remarkably from the tiny, vulnerable creature Marcus had rescued. Though still not full-sized, he now moved with the coordinated grace of a young dog coming into his strength, his previous injury evident only to those who knew to look for the subtle compensation in his gait. "Ready for inspection, soldier?" Marcus asked, kneeling to make final adjustments to the collar. Phoenix responded with perfect stillness, holding the formal posture they had practiced during their training sessions. The behavior wasn't required for a pet, but had become part of their shared language, a ritual that connected them through mutual understanding of expectations and responses. The decision to attend the ceremony had not been made lightly. In the weeks following Frank Calloway's visit, Marcus had carefully weighed the potential benefits against the psychological costs of public interaction. The process itself represented significant progress, a thoughtful evaluation rather than automatic rejection of social engagement. 2 factors had ultimately tipped the balance toward attendance. First, Phoenix's development had reached a stage where controlled exposure to new environments and people would benefit his continued training. Second, and perhaps more significantly, the event's focus on the bond between veterans and their canine companions offered a context where Marcus's military identity could be acknowledged without becoming the sole defining characteristic by which others perceived him. The drive to the memorial would be their longest journey together, and Marcus had prepared for it with characteristic thoroughness. Phoenix's travel crate secured in the truck bed, water bowl, and emergency supplies packed, their route planned to avoid the busiest parts of town. These precautions weren't merely about controlling external variables, but about managing his own potential reactions to unexpected situations after years of deliberate isolation. "This is a reconnaissance mission," Marcus informed Phoenix as they departed the cabin. "Observe, engage as required, and withdraw if necessary. No heroics." The puppy watched him from the passenger seat with that particular intensity that sometimes made Marcus wonder exactly how much human speech he comprehended. The dog's unwavering gaze offered neither judgment nor pressure, just the steady presence that had somehow become essential to Marcus's gradually expanding world. As they approached the memorial, Marcus could see that the gathering was larger than he had anticipated. Perhaps 20 vehicles were parked in the small lot and along the adjacent road, and a group of approximately 40 people stood in loose formation around the weathered stone monument where he had found Phoenix. Most were older veterans like Calloway, but Marcus noted several younger men and women whose bearing instantly identified them as recently discharged service members. More surprising was the canine presence. Not just the expected service dogs in formal harnesses, but a diverse assembly of companions ranging from a three-legged retired military working dog to an elderly golden retriever wearing a therapy dog. A vest. Each animal stood or sat beside its human partner with the focused attention characteristic of dogs with purpose. Marcus parked at the perimeter of the gathering, deliberately positioning his truck for a quick exit if needed. As he lifted Phoenix from the passenger seat, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded his most challenging public interactions. The physical manifestation of psychological barriers erected against potential triggers, judgment, or unwanted attention. "Steady," he murmured, though whether to Phoenix or himself remained unclear. The puppy responded by aligning perfectly at his left side, matching Marcus's stride with the coordinated movement they had practiced during their walks around the property. Frank Calloway spotted them from the edge of the gathering and approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to respecting others' boundaries. He wore a simple VFW cap and a windbreaker with his unit insignia, but no other conspicuous military identifiers. "Sergeant Reeves," he greeted with a nod that conveyed respect without unnecessary formality. "Glad you could make it." His eyes moved to Phoenix, noting the puppy's perfect position and attentive posture. Impressive discipline for one so young. "He's a quick study," Marcus acknowledged, the simple praise for Phoenix offering easier entry into conversation than direct personal interaction would have. Calloway gestured toward the gathering. "We keep it informal. No speeches, no politics, just recognition of the bond." He paused, then added with the direct honesty that had characterized their first meeting, "No obligation to interact beyond your comfort level. Being present is enough." The consideration behind this statement, the recognition of Marcus's potential struggle without drawing unnecessary attention to it, created an unexpected sense of safety. Calloway understood the challenges veterans faced in social settings not as theoretical concepts, but from personal experience, and his approach reflected this shared understanding. As they moved toward the memorial, Phoenix maintained his position. Despite the novel stimuli, other dogs, unfamiliar people, new scents and sounds that might have overwhelmed a less focused animal, his occasional glances toward Marcus seemed to check for guidance rather than seeking reassurance, a distinction that reflected their evolving relationship from rescuer and victim to working partners. The ceremony itself was indeed informal. A simple acknowledgement of the role dogs had played in military operations throughout history, followed by recognition of the continued service many provided to veterans struggling with physical and psychological wounds. The presentation avoided both excessive sentimentality and rigid military formality, striking a balance that respected the significance of these partnerships without politicizing or dramatizing them. Marcus found himself able to remain present. Throughout the short ceremony, his anxiety managed through the grounding presence of Phoenix at his side and the respectful space maintained by those around him. No one approached directly or made demands for interaction, yet he didn't feel isolated or excluded, a delicate balance he had assumed impossible in social settings. Following the formal recognition, the gathering transitioned to informal interaction, veterans and their canine companions mingling in small groups, sharing experiences and information with the specialized focus characteristic of communities, built around shared understanding rather than social convention. A young woman with a prosthetic leg approached, her service dog, a black Labrador with distinguished gray around his muzzle, moving with the deliberate care of an animal, conscious of his handler's needs. She stopped at a respectful distance, her body language open but not intrusive. "Captain Riley Hayes," she introduced herself, the military title used as identifier rather than status marker. "My partner is Sergeant Whiskey." She nodded toward the Labrador. who maintained alert attention to her movements despite his evident age. Marcus noted the captain's 10th Mountain Division patch, his former unit, and felt an unexpected connection that transcended the usual discomfort of new introductions. "Sergeant Marcus Reeves," he responded, the familiar protocol creating structure for an interaction that might otherwise have felt threatening. "This is Phoenix." Captain Hayes nodded toward Phoenix with professional assessment. Impressive training for a puppy that young, especially given what Frank mentioned about his injury. Her direct acknowledgement of Phoenix's condition carried no pity, only recognition of challenges overcome, the same matter-of-fact respect she likely expected for her own visible disability. "He's determined," Marcus said, finding it easier to discuss Phoenix's recovery than he would have imagined possible in a conversation with a stranger. "Adapts to limitations instead of being defined by them." The captain's smile suggested she recognized the broader application of this observation. "Best quality in a partner, military or otherwise?" She gestured toward her own dog. "Whiskey taught me that after I came home. I was focused on what I'd lost. He was focused on what we could still do together." The simple statement carried profound resonance, not as therapeutic platitude, but as practical wisdom from someone who had navigated similar territory. Marcus found himself engaging in genuine conversation about their respective rehabilitation experiences, the training, approaches that had proven most effective, and the unexpected benefits of partnership that extended beyond practical assistance. Throughout this exchange, Phoenix maintained his position beside Marcus, occasionally making eye contact with Whiskey in what seemed like professional acknowledgement between canine colleagues. The puppy's composed presence in this novel social situation represented significant progress from the traumatized creature Marcus had rescued, evidence of resilience that continued to exceed expectations. As the gathering began to disperse, several other veterans approached to introduce themselves and their companions, each interaction building on the foundation established by Captain Hayes: respect for boundaries, shared understanding of military experience, and genuine interest in Phoenix's development. These brief exchanges, focused primarily on training techniques and canine capabilities, created connections without triggering the overwhelming social pressure Marcus had come to dread in civilian interactions. Frank Calloway reappeared as the event concluded, accompanied by an older Labrador with a grey muzzle and the calm demeanor of an animal secure in its purpose. "My partner, Ranger," he introduced. 9 years as my constant companion through the rough patches." The subtle acknowledgement of struggle without elaborate explanation reflected the communicative style that had made Calloway accessible when others had failed to connect. He understood the language of indirect reference that veterans often employed when discussing psychological challenges, a code that conveyed meaning without requiring explicit vulnerability. "Wanted to introduce you to someone before you head out," Calloway continued, gesturing toward a middle-aged man in a wheelchair approaching from the parking area. "Mike Donovan runs the Regional Service Dog Training Program Captain Ramirez mentioned, former handler for the military working dog program before his injury." Mike Donovan's wheelchair moved with the precision of someone long accustomed to navigating the world from this perspective. The German Shepherd beside him matched this careful movement, maintaining perfect position while scanning the environment. With professional assessment, the dog's harness identified him as both service animal and training demonstration partner. "Sergeant Reeves," Donovan greeted him with direct eye contact and a firm handshake. "Frank mentioned your work with Phoenix. Impressive results for someone without formal training." "Trial and error," Marcus responded, uncomfortable with praise, but recognizing the professional evaluation behind it. "Adapting military protocols to his specific needs." Donovan nodded, his expression reflecting understanding beyond the specifics of dog training. Best approach there is. The standardized methods are just starting points. It's the customization that makes the difference. He gestured toward Phoenix. Mind if I observe his response patterns? The request was delivered with professional respect rather than personal curiosity, creating space for Marcus to decline without awkwardness. Instead, he found himself agreeing to a brief demonstration of Phoenix's current capabilities, basic commands and position work they had practiced during their daily sessions. As Phoenix moved through the exercises with focused attention, Donovan watched with the specialized interest of someone who understood the significance of small details in training development. His observations, offered without presumption or criticism, reflected genuine appreciation for the bond Marcus had established with the young dog. He trusts your judgment completely, Donovan noted, as Phoenix maintained a commanded position. Despite distractions from nearby activity, that's not about technique, it's about relationship. The simple validation, coming from someone with professional expertise rather than casual observation, carried unexpected weight. Marcus had approached Phoenix's rehabilitation with disciplined commitment, but without external metrics for success beyond basic physical recovery. Donovan's assessment provided contextual understanding of what they had accomplished together. The program Captain Ramirez mentioned, Marcus found himself asking, what exactly would involvement entail? The question emerged not from obligation or social pressure, but from genuine interest, a significant shift from the automatic rejection that had characterized his response to previous outreach attempts. Something about this gathering, about witnessing the various manifestations of the human-canine partnership across different veterans' experiences, had created space for considering possibilities beyond his established isolation. Donovan outlined the program with practical specificity, the initial consultation role that would allow Marcus to contribute expertise without excessive social demands, the potential for more direct involvement as trainer or mentor if he found it beneficial, the flexible participation structure designed to accommodate veterans with varying comfort levels for public interaction. No contracts, no obligations beyond what works for you and Phoenix, Donovan concluded. Just an opportunity to share what you've clearly figured out through your own experience. As Marcus considered this information, Phoenix completed his circuit of the memorial grounds and returned to perfect position at his side, looking up with what could only be described as satisfaction in a job well executed. The puppy's progress from traumatized victim to confident partner represented tangible evidence of what committed rehabilitation could accomplish, not just physically, but in terms of trust, purpose, and forward movement. I'll think about it, Marcus said. The response, neither commitment nor rejection, but genuine consideration, a middle path that would have been impossible for him to navigate even months earlier. As they prepared to depart, Marcus found himself exchanging contact information with several of the veterans he had met, not from social obligation, but from practical interest in their training approaches and experiences. These connections, focused on shared purposeful activity rather than general socialization, created potential pathways for selective engagement that respected his continued need for substantial personal space. The drive back to the cabin carried none of the anxiety that had accompanied their journey to the memorial. Phoenix dozed in the passenger seat, exhausted from the mental stimulation of the new environment, but showing no signs of stress or regression. His ability to engage with the novel situation while maintaining his training reflected resilience that continued to exceed expectations. As they turned onto the familiar gravel road leading to the cabin, Marcus realized that the day's experience had shifted something fundamental in his perception of both his own capabilities and potential futures. The gathering had demonstrated possibilities for connection that didn't require abandoning the boundaries necessary for his psychological well-being. Selective engagement focused on shared purpose rather than social performance. This middle path, neither complete isolation nor forced reintegration, offered sustainable possibility in a world that had previously seemed to present only impossible extremes. Like Phoenix learning to walk with his adapted gait, perhaps Marcus could develop his own modified approach to engagement, one that acknowledged limitations without being defined by them. 2 weeks after the K-9 Veterans Ceremony, Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing the detailed proposal Mike Donovan had sent regarding the service dog training program. The document outlined a framework for his potential involvement that began with a limited consulting role, sharing his rehabilitation experience with Phoenix through written reports and occasional video calls, avoiding the immediate pressure of in-person interaction while still contributing meaningful expertise. Phoenix lay at his feet, no longer the tiny, vulnerable puppy Marcus had rescued, but a growing dog whose strength and confidence increased daily. At nearly 5 months old, he had developed a distinctive personality, serious and focused during training sessions, playfully expressive during their break periods, and unfailingly attentive to Marcus's moods and needs. The lingering effects of his spinal injury remained visible only to those who knew to look for the subtle adaptation in his movement, a testament to both his resilience and the effectiveness of their rehabilitation work. Marcus's phone vibrated. On the desk, a text message from Captain Riley Hayes, one of the veterans he had met at the ceremony. Over the past 2 weeks, they had exchanged occasional messages about training techniques and equipment modifications, the focused nature of these communications making them manageable even on days when broader social interaction felt impossible. Today's message was different. Whiskey and I are working with a group of elementary school kids on safety awareness next Saturday. Could use Phoenix's demonstration of a dog in training if you're interested. No pressure. Just thought his size and training level would be perfect for showing the difference between working dogs and pets. Riley. The invitation represented a significant escalation from their previous exchanges, not just text communication, but actual in-person interaction, not just with Riley, but with civilians, including children. 6 months ago, Marcus would have dismissed such a suggestion immediately. The mere thought of such exposure triggering anxiety severe enough to require isolation for days afterward. Now, he found himself weighing the proposition with unexpected objectivity. The setting would be challenging, but structured, focused on Phoenix rather than himself, with Riley present as buffer and ally. Most importantly, it represented an opportunity for Phoenix to experience new environments and stimuli crucial for his continued development. Marcus was still considering his response when a knock at the door broke his concentration. Phoenix immediately moved to alert position, ears forward but not displaying aggression, his trained response to unexpected visitors that balanced protective instinct with controlled assessment. Through the window, Marcus recognized Frank Calloway's black pickup and felt an unexpected sense of relief rather than the usual tension that accompanied uninvited visitors. The older veteran had established himself as someone who respected boundaries while offering connection on terms Marcus could manage, a rare combination that had made their limited interactions valuable rather than threatening. When Marcus opened the door, he immediately noted that Calloway wasn't alone. Beside him stood an athletic man in his 30s with the unmistakable posture of military service despite his civilian clothing. More surprising was the animal at his side, a German shepherd whose resemblance to Phoenix was striking despite being fully grown and bearing the distinguished bearing of a trained working dog. "Hope we're not intruding," Calloway said. Noting Marcus's momentary hesitation, "This is Staff Sergeant James Winters and his partner Echo. They're part of the training program Mike mentioned, and I thought their experience might be relevant to Phoenix's development." Marcus recognized the deliberate strategy, introducing the visitor in a context directly related to Phoenix's training rather than a social call, providing clear purpose that made the unexpected interaction easier to process and accept. The consideration behind this approach created space for Marcus to engage without feeling trapped or exposed. "Come in," he offered, stepping back to allow entry while maintaining his own comfortable distance. Phoenix remained in perfect position beside him, alert but calm as the visitors entered. Staff Sergeant Winters moved with the fluid efficiency characteristic of special operations personnel, his eyes making a quick, professional assessment of the space without being intrusive. The shepherd at his side, Echo, mirrored this disciplined awareness, maintaining perfect position while clearly observing and cataloging every detail of the new environment. "Impressive control," Marcus noted, "professional appreciation creating natural opening for communication where social pleasantries might have felt forced." Winters nodded, acknowledging the observation without false modesty. 3 years of partnership builds solid communication." He gestured toward Phoenix. "Frank mentioned your work with him after his injury. Remarkable progress for his age." The direct focus on Phoenix's development, rather than Marcus's personal history, created comfortable territory for interaction. As they moved to the main room, Marcus found himself engaged in detailed discussion of training methodologies, rehabilitation techniques, and the specific challenges of working with an animal recovering from physical trauma. Winters shared his experience with Echo, who had suffered shrapnel injuries during a deployment that had also left Winters with hearing loss in his right ear. The parallel recovery created different dynamics than standard training, he explained. "We were both adapting to new limitations at the same time, figuring out compensation strategies together." This description of mutual adaptation resonated deeply with Marcus's experience with Phoenix. Their rehabilitation had indeed been reciprocal, Phoenix learning to navigate physical limitations while Marcus confronted psychological barriers that had confined him since his return from deployment. The conversation shifted to Phoenix's current capabilities and potential development path. With Marcus's permission, Winters conducted a brief evaluation, observing the puppy's response patterns, spatial awareness, and focus during basic command execution. "He has natural aptitude for scent detection," Winters noted. As Phoenix completed a simple search exercise they improvised using household items. The way he processes olfactory information shows advanced discrimination ability even without specialized training. This professional assessment of Phoenix's capabilities, identifying potential beyond what Marcus had recognized, created a strange sense of pride that transcended his usual emotional restraints. Like a parent hearing unexpected praise for their child's talents, Marcus found himself experiencing vicarious satisfaction in Phoenix's recognized potential. "The program needs evaluators who understand trauma and recovery," Winters continued, the transition to the service dog program topic emerging organically from their discussion rather than feeling like a recruitment pitch. "Dogs who've overcome injuries bring different capabilities to partnerships with veterans facing similar challenges. Your experience with Phoenix would be invaluable in identifying these connections." What struck Marcus most about this conversation was its substantive focus, no platitudes about giving back or reintegration into society, just practical recognition of specialized knowledge that could benefit others facing similar challenges. The approach respected his experience without presuming to understand his personal journey, offering engagement based on competence rather than obligation. As the discussion continued, Frank Calloway mentioned a specific case that had prompted their visit. A recently returned Marine recovering from spinal injuries similar to Phoenix's, paired with a shepherd mix rescued from an abusive situation. The partnership showed promise, but faced challenges regarding mobility adaptation and trust development. Mike thought your documentation of Phoenix's rehabilitation might provide insights for their training approach, Calloway explained. Your journals are apparently the most detailed recovery mapping he's seen outside professional rehabilitation centers. The reference to his journals, shared with Mike Donovan as part of his initial contribution to the program, reminded Marcus of how far this process had taken him from his original isolation. What had begun as private documentation of Phoenix's progress for veterinary purposes had evolved into a resource others found valuable, creating connection without requiring physical presence or extensive social interaction. Would you consider meeting with them? Winters asked, the question direct but presented without pressure. Not immediately, but once you've had time to review their case file. Your experience with Phoenix offers perspective no one else in the program currently has. The request represented significant escalation, not just sharing information remotely, but direct engagement with a veteran and dog facing challenges similar to what he and Phoenix had overcome. The practical focus made it less threatening than general social interaction, but it still represented a step beyond the boundaries Marcus had maintained since his return. As he considered this proposition, Phoenix moved to sit beside him, making gentle contact that seemed almost deliberately supportive, a behavior the puppy had developed during moments when Marcus faced difficult decisions or experienced heightened anxiety. This simple presence created grounding that allowed more objective consideration of the request without immediate defensive reaction. "I'd need to review their situation first," Marcus said finally. "Understand their specific challenges before determining if my experience is actually relevant." This response, neither acceptance nor refusal, but thoughtful, conditional consideration, represented significant evolution from the automatic rejection that would have characterized similar situations months earlier. The ability to evaluate engagement based on specific parameters rather than categorical avoidance marked genuine progress in Marcus's relationship with the wider world. Winters nodded with professional understanding, reaching into his bag to retrieve a sealed folder. "Their case documentation, review at your convenience, no timeline pressure. My contact information is included if you have questions or decide to proceed." The remainder of their visit maintained this pattern of purposeful exchange rather than social obligation. Echo demonstrated advanced training protocols that might benefit Phoenix's development, while Winters shared practical modifications they had developed to address his hearing limitation, adaptations that might apply to Phoenix's occasional weakness in his right hind leg. When the visitors departed an hour later, Marcus experienced none of the relief that typically followed social interaction, no sense of having survived an ordeal or need for extended recovery time. Instead, he felt a strange combination of mental stimulation and focused purpose, his thoughts already processing the information exchange and considering its applications to Phoenix's continued development. Phoenix himself seemed energized rather than stressed by the interaction, moving through his training circuit with exceptional focus after the visitors departed, as if demonstrating his capabilities had motivated rather than depleted him. His response suggested that controlled expansion of their world might benefit his development rather than threatening his progress, a possibility Marcus had not previously considered. That evening, after completing their regular training session, Marcus opened the case file Winters had provided. The documentation detailed the Marine's injuries, recovery progress, and psychological challenges alongside the shepherd mix's rescue. Circumstances, physical condition, and behavioral patterns. The parallels to his situation with Phoenix were indeed striking, though with important distinctions that would require careful consideration. As he reviewed the materials, Marcus found himself taking notes, not just observations, but potential approaches, adaptations of techniques that had proven effective with Phoenix, considerations for the specific circumstances described. The process engaged his analytical capabilities in ways that felt both familiar and novel. The strategic thinking of his military training applied to a context of healing rather than combat. This productive focus continued into the following day as Marcus expanded his notes into more detailed recommendations, referencing his journals for specific milestones in Phoenix's recovery and the interventions that had proven most effective at each stage. The work absorbed him completely, creating flow state he hadn't experienced since before his injury, the satisfying immersion in purposeful activity that had once characterized his most effective performance as squad leader. When he finally completed the assessment, Marcus had produced 15 pages of detailed analysis and practical recommendations, far more comprehensive than the brief consultation he had initially considered. The document represented not just sharing of experience, but genuine investment in the success of another recovery journey, a willingness to extend the knowledge gained through his work with Phoenix for the benefit of others facing similar challenges. This extension beyond self-interest marks significant psychological shift, not dramatic transformation or complete healing, but meaningful movement from the contracted focus of trauma response toward the expanded awareness that had characterized his pre-injury identity. Like Phoenix, adapting his gait to accommodate physical limitation, Marcus was developing modified but effective ways of engaging with purpose beyond immediate survival. Before sending the completed assessment, Marcus added a final note: available for follow-up consultation if implementation questions arise, virtual initially, in-person possibilities to be determined based on progress and specific needs. This measured openness to further engagement, with clear boundaries but without absolute limitation, represented perhaps the most significant milestone yet in his gradual reconnection with meaningful purpose beyond his isolated existence. The CE offering was neither dramatic self-sacrifice nor reluctant obligation, but thoughtful extension of specialized knowledge that might genuinely benefit others. As he prepared to email the document to Winters, Phoenix brought his training dumbbell, their signal for evening practice session, and placed it precisely at Marcus's feet, looking up with expectant focus. The simple action, performed with perfect timing as Marcus completed his work, seemed to embody the balanced partnership they had developed, each contributing their strengths while accommodating the other's needs. "Good call," Marcus acknowledged, saving the document and rising to engage with Phoenix's request. Work completed, time for practice. As they moved through their evening routine, executing familiar commands with precision that reflected months of consistent training, Marcus recognized that their journey together had created something neither could have achieved alone. Not just physical rehabilitation or psychological healing, but a partnership that amplified their respective capabilities while mitigating individual limitations. This recognition carried implications beyond their immediate circumstances, possibilities for engagement that honored both his continued need for controlled interaction and his emerging capacity for meaningful contribution. The path forward remained uncertain, but for the first time since his injury, uncertainty felt less like threat and more like potential, a range of possibilities rather than a series of obstacles. Like Phoenix learning to run with his adapted gait, different from standard movement but equally effective in achieving his goals, perhaps Marcus was developing his own modified approach to purposeful engagement with the world beyond his cabin walls. 6 months after rescuing Phoenix from the war memorial, Marcus stood at the edge of the community center parking lot, watching families arrive for the children's safety program. Phoenix sat perfectly positioned at his side, now nearly 7 months old, and bearing little resemblance to the trembling puppy who had faced death beneath circling crows. His coat gleamed with health, his posture reflected confidence, and his alert yet calm demeanor demonstrated training that belied his youth. Captain Riley Hayes had already set up her demonstration area inside, a small arena marked with colored tape where her service dog Whiskey would demonstrate proper interaction protocols for children encountering working dogs. Phoenix's role would be more limited, a supervised introduction showing the difference between fully trained service animals and those still developing their skills. The controlled environment and clearly defined parameters had made this engagement possible for Marcus, who continued to approach public interaction with careful preparation rather than casual acceptance. "This is a teaching mission," Marcus reminded Phoenix as they performed their final equipment check. The puppy wore his training vest, not a service dog harness, but special gear that identified him as a dog in training and helped both Phoenix and others understand when he was working versus when he could interact more freely. "We demonstrate, we educate, we maintain discipline." The military framing wasn't affectation, but effective communication strategy, language that created structure and clarity for both handler and dog. Phoenix had responded to this approach from their earliest training days, seeming to recognize the seriousness of purpose behind the terminology. As they prepared to enter the building, Marcus noted a familiar vehicle arriving, Mike Donovan's adapted van with its specialized ramp for his wheelchair. The appearance of the program director wasn't surprising. He coordinated most public education events, but his presence added another layer of significance to Marcus's participation. This wouldn't just be supporting Riley's presentation, but direct engagement with the formal program he had been gradually connecting with over recent months. Since completing his assessment for Staff Sergeant Winters and the injured Marine, Marcus had provided consultation for 3 additional cases, all remotely, all focused on specific rehabilitation challenges that paralleled his experience with Phoenix. Each case had expanded his involvement incrementally without pushing beyond sustainable boundaries, creating a pattern of graduated engagement that respected his continued need for substantial control over social interaction. Today represented the next logical progression: public participation in a structured educational context where his expertise with Phoenix provided clear purpose beyond mere social presence. The defined parameters, 90 minutes, focused on the dogs, with Riley as primary presenter, made the engagement challenging but manageable. McDonovan spotted them as he deployed his wheelchair ramp and offered a simple nod of acknowledgement. No effusive greeting or exaggerated enthusiasm, just professional recognition that respected Marcus's preference for subdued interaction. This consideration characterized all of Donovan's communication, demonstrating the program director's genuine understanding of how different veterans required different approaches to engagement. "Glad you could make it," Donovan said as he maneuvered his wheelchair alongside them. "Phoenix looks ready for action." "As ready as his training level permits," Marcus responded, professional assessment creating comfortable conversational territory. "He's still developing impulse control around high-energy situations." "Perfect teaching opportunity," Donovan noted. "The kids need to understand the difference between dogs at various training stages. Your work with him provides excellent illustration of the development process." This focus on educational value rather than social participation shifted the framework from personal challenge to professional contribution, a distinction that made Marcus's presence about purpose rather than performance. The approach respected his capabilities while acknowledging his continued boundaries around casual interaction. Inside the community center, Riley had organized the space with military efficiency, clearly marked areas for demonstration, seating, arranged for optimal visibility, and visual aids positioned to reinforce key concepts. Whiskey, her black Labrador, maintained perfect position despite the increasing activity as parents and children arrived, his professional focus undistracted by the commotion. Phoenix will be perfect for showing the training progression, Riley explained as she reviewed the program structure. Whiskey demonstrates fully developed service dog capabilities, while Phoenix shows the intermediate stage where core skills are established but still being refined. The presentation framework placed minimal demands on Marcus himself. He would handle Phoenix through demonstration exercises while Riley provided the educational narration. This division of responsibilities created participation without exposure, contribution without unnecessary visibility. As the room filled with families, Phoenix maintained his composed alertness, occasionally glancing at Marcus for reassurance, but showing none of the anxiety or overstimulation that might be expected. From a young dog in such an environment, his ability to remain focused amid potential distractions represented months of graduated training, starting with basic commands in quiet settings, then adding controlled distractions, and finally practicing in increasingly complex environments. When Riley began the formal presentation, Marcus positioned Phoenix at the edge of the demonstration area, visible but not central, involved but not immediately engaged. This strategic placement allowed the puppy to acclimate to the audience while maintaining the security of relative distance. Service dogs and working dogs undergo extensive training before they're ready for full responsibilities, Riley explained. To the gathered children, today we'll see different stages of that development, from a dog still learning his skills to one with years of professional experience. As she described the training progression, Marcus noted Phoenix's response to the children's energy, alert interest, without the excessive excitement that might have characterized a typical puppy his age. The months of structured training had created capacity for focus that transcended natural developmental tendencies, allowing disciplined engagement even in stimulating environments. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.